You know, this experiment actually entirely started with just one comment. On my most recent video, one of my most recent videos, there was a comment specifically referring to how FSR actually has better support in Linux through Proton. Now, I had speculated in said video that Linux and Proton would enable FSR to be modded into more games. But then that poses the question, how do? Hello and welcome. My name is Wolfie and you are watching GreaterThanPie. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. You see, personally, I generally like to create my videos by experimenting, testing, and then presenting my findings. But today we're going to do something a bit more dynamic. You see, behind me, I actually have a system set up. This system is, of course, running Windows, but by the time we're done, we should be running Linux. Now, Linux is interesting because it's completely open source. Most of the time it's completely free. It really has slowly become the biggest competitor Windows has when it comes to custom built PCs. And I know for a lot of you guys, it's been on your mind, like how easy is it to install and switch to Linux? And that is what I want to test today. There's a reason I'm going in blind because I actually haven't touched a Linux distro aside from the Raspberry Pi based one. So when it comes down to it, I am definitely a beginner when it comes to installing Linux, and I don't even know which versions of Linux can actually run Proton. Because of that, I am coming from the same perspective that you would be if you were doing it for your first time. But then why Linux? Why has it been brought to the forefront? Why have you been hearing more and more and more about this operating system? Microsoft really screwed up. You see, Windows 10 was actually widely accepted in the grand scheme of Windows. It was good. Now, there were some things that turned a couple of people off, like its insane amount of data collection, but the number of computers actually running it outgrew even Microsoft's expectation. Because of that, Windows 10 had a pretty decent life on it. But with the announcement of Windows 11, Microsoft took everything that they learned from Windows 10, threw it out the window, and called it a day. When it comes down to it, a lot of people who have computers that are perfectly good and quite capable still are going to be edged out. I've actually sold one of my computers that will not be able to upgrade to Windows 11 before I knew about Windows 11, of course. My DIY sort of NAS, sort of not really need to make it a real NAS computer also will be affected and cannot run Windows anymore at Windows 11. It's got too old of hardware. So when it comes down to it, there are a lot of people looking for an alternative because once Microsoft drops support, well, those people are screwed. Look at Windows XP. There was a mad dash and scramble to get off of XP because Microsoft cut support for it at some point, and they are not going to make that same mistake twice. So they're going to cut Windows 10 much earlier than they would have for XP, Vista, etc. Granted, if you were still using Vista, what's wrong with you? Digressing a little bit, let's actually get to the meat and potatoes of this. Linux, on the other hand, is free. It's open source and it's community driven, meaning if something isn't supported, it's only a matter of time before it is. And Linux can be put on such a wide variety of hardware, it's not even funny. And because there's not a centralized distro, privacy tends to be at the forefront. They don't have as stringent data collection as Microsoft does. And because it's open source, you can just open it up and look to see if it's there. So when it comes down to it, Linux looks like a great alternative, but there has been challenges. For one, gaming was a challenge. And that is one of the things that I want to test today. Are games going to work better now that Proton is being fully developed? And for those of you who don't know what Proton is Steam's own in-house compatibility layer for Windows games to work on Linux. Now, in recent years, developers actually have been developing more and more for Linux with better and better Linux support. So there might be some games that don't even need Proton work. And thanks to the Steam Deck, we're going to be seeing Proton more widely accepted in the greater community, which means that from a gaming perspective, Linux might be the next best option. But without further ado, let me actually figure out how to run this thing, because I really don't know. This really is going to be a brand new experiment for me.
Now here's where things get interesting. I don't actually know what I'm doing when it comes to installing Linux, so we're gonna need to start with research. I simply typed into Google, what is the best Linux distro for gaming? And I got this article from Tom's Hardware. Now, I've used Tom's Hardware in the past. I don't consider them an infallible source, but this was rather convenient because Pop was right here at the top and it looked pretty straightforward. In fact, it looked an awful lot like Windows. So I went ahead and downloaded that. Now, Pop is made by System 76, which, if you've watched Linus Tech Tips a bit, is one of Anthony's favorite companies, apparently. He says he's not a fanboy, but we all know that he secretly is. But after I got it installed, we just needed to create a bootable media device. You can do this pretty easily, but they actually have a tutorial right here on the website, so we're going to go ahead and use it ourselves. Now, once we had a bootable media device, it was quite simple from here. We just installed it like any other operating system, and that was it. It just worked, like no problems. It didn't need to install drivers. It didn't need to do anything crazy. I got this really cool screenshot of it looking like it's like doing something crazy, but no, it's pretty normal actually. In fact, it looks an awful lot like Windows. Now, once we got into the operating system, we needed to install Steam, which is actually front and center in the Pop shop, which is actually really convenient. From there, we're gonna have to change a couple of small settings to get games running. We're going to first need to enable the experimental Proton mode in Steam itself. Now, this can be done pretty much the same way that you would change any Steam settings, and after you do that, it will allow you to install any game on Linux, given that it might just not work.
So it just works. This is not the conclusion I necessarily thought we'd be coming to. I honestly thought that this would be a lot harder. I blocked out an entire afternoon in order to get this to work, but it just does. And that's nuts. So honestly, what is the conclusion here? Well, Linux might actually be a viable option if Windows 11 is not. Now, I am going to test further. I actually have only really fulfilled a little bit of the comments that inspired this. I need to test FSR on Linux because I need Proton in order to do it. There's a small problem. This computer, I love it, but it is awaiting a graphics card upgrade. This has been on hold, this project, for the entire time that graphics cards have been in shortage. And due to other circumstances, I still need to put a new GPU in, which means I cannot test on this computer, which means I am going to have to install Linux on my main computer. We're gonna do it. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna test it next. Now, that will be a different video because I'm going to dig into it. I'm going to get this thing running as best as I can, and I'm going to try to run FSR with just Linux, like have a secondary boot on there of Linux. There's a whole world to explore, and I'm only now starting to explore it. But today's goal was to see how easy it was. Is it a viable option for gaming? And what shortcomings are there? Now, there are some shortcomings. The fact that we can't get Doom Eternal running without figuring it out, that's a shortcoming. The fact that I had to look up a tutorial on how to get Proton running is a shortcoming. But the truth is, this is easier than it has ever been. And it worked better than any time I've ever tried to run Linux in the past. Granted, it was over 10 years ago since the last time I tried to run Linux. And I'm blown away that it just works. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video or found it helpful and informative, consider giving it a like, maybe comment down below. And if you're thinking of switching to Linux, let me know, because I'm certainly more of a believer of the Penguin than I was like before this started. But that's where we're gonna wrap up. So thank you guys again. Wolfie out.